here with me. I could set you free of the pain and misery and let you be here with me. I could set you free. I could set you free. Could set you free. Show you what this world can really be. Here with me, I could set you free. Off the pain and misery and let you be. Here with me, I could set you
no
quiet. I hear the thunder that comes from far away. It's like a noise in my head. Oh, this world heart, this world heart, it cuts you deep and leaves the sky. Oh, this world heart, it cuts you deep and leaves the sky. We need to get out, 'cause it's full apart, and it frees your heart. It's no longer the same. 'Cause it's full apart, and it frees your heart. It's no longer the same. We need to get out here. We need to get out of here. We need to get out of here. All we need to do is to get out of here. We need to get out of here. We need to get out of here. All we need to do is to get out Oh, this world heart, it cuts you deep and leaves the sky. Oh, this world heart, it cuts you deep and leaves the sky. We need to get out, 'cause it's full apart, and it frees your heart. It's no longer the same. 'Cause it's full apart, and it frees your heart. It's no longer the same. We need to get up here.
Well, hello and welcome to the first webinar of the Pet Food Science Podcast, where our goal today is to talk about reaching optimum nutrition and 3 things that we should consider. I'm your host today, Dr. Kate Shoveler from the University of Guelph, and I'm here with today's guest, Dr. Dennis Jewell, our other host for the podcast. To set the foundation, Dr. Jewell will do a short presentation and then we'll have a deeper and more fulsome discussion about the information. We intend to do this in 3 blocks. First, we will cover optimization through not feeding populations, but through DNA-driven knowledge and feeding the individual pet. Second, we'll talk about bringing into pet food science an improved idea of balance, meaning improvements through specific interactions and ratios of nutrients. And third, we'll talk about feeding the whole organism, including the microbiota, to establish what factors might be maximized in the microbiota and what can be done to enhance them. Dr. Dennis Jewell is currently an adjunct professor at Kansas State University and was formerly head of pet nutrition, head of the Nutrition Innovation Group and a research science. Nutritional research during the time that has seen an explosion of capacity to measure, understand, and apply the effects of nutrition on optimizing health and aiding in the management of disease. He has authored and co-authored over 300 book chapters, patents, peer-reviewed articles, and abstracts. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dennis Jewell. Dennis?
Hi, thank you, Kate, and I'm pleased to be here. I think this is going to be an exciting time. I'm glad that we have the opportunity to talk together and with the group. I have a presentation. I'm going to jump into it. So we'll just go through those things that you set, and I think it's going to be fun. We'll see, given opportunity for interactions, and here I'm setting up to share my screen. So if this works, we'll be in success. So this is reaching optimum nutrition, 3 things we might be missing. And of course, yeah, I am presenting. So the idea is, well, what do our pets need? This is my pet Wishful. We were both younger. But we ask this question, right? We know a lot. We do many things to enhance the lives of our pets, to lengthen and enrich the special relationship between people and their pets. But for this webinar, we think, well, what's out there? Maybe what's on the horizon? What's a little further than where we've gone today? And I think there's much to learn. You know, we want to have that, you know, sort of ideally, we would be having a food for each individual pet. And that doesn't mean that each pet has its unique food, which it might be the ultimate goal, but perhaps there's a way to better define what those needs are for each pet, so that we could say, for this pet, we would want this particular food beyond what we're doing today. And we want to try a truly balanced food. You know, we know as nutritionists, we know there's always this continuum between too much and too little. And those are words that only have meaning with respect to what is optimum. So we say if we have too little of it, we're maybe deficient, or we have some inadequacies, we reach this area of best nutrition, maybe finely tuned to optimum nutrition. And as that nutrient moves beyond that, then we get to a place where there's some problems with those excess intakes, and maybe even an outright problem with that. So we have that. And then the third point that I want to talk about, and is one that perhaps I've most intrigued by, but also least knowledgeable in, is this area of feeding for the pet and the microbiome. When I was first entering nutrition, I laugh at it now, but we just sort of thought of the GI tract as a tube through the body, and what mattered was what came out of that. But now we know there's much that matters with what's going on within it, and those microbes really make a difference. So the first one that we're going to talk about in our time today is that we want to optimize for the individual. We know much about pets, right? We know, for example, that dogs and cats need a different food. And that was the first, you know, when pets are eating scraps, and we had that dog sort of coming alongside us, and the cat maybe working a little outside with us, controlling the rodents. We thought, oh, there was a different food for them. Cats, as we know now, are obligate carnivores, and so some meat and the nutrients associated with meat are just going to be required. Dogs are omnivores. They're carnivores in the sense that they love to eat meat, but they certainly do well with many attributes of the omnivore. And so we have the dog and the cat separating, and yet that's a long way from where we would wish to be, which is that individual. And so we start out with sort of saying, well, if we're going to isolate that food for an individual, we want perhaps first to say what's that life stage of the pet. We recognize that the young pet is going to be maybe different than the adult, different again the mature adult, and if there's a continuum in nutrient supply that perhaps we want to change with the life, we recognize that we maybe start along this path of getting that finely tuned nutrition there. And we optimize for lifestyle. I sort of have to point out this picture. I had an artist make it once. I was kind of proud of it, in the idea of saying, lifestyle changes, maybe this in playing a little joke on our evolutionary perspective, but depending on what we're doing with our pets, there's an association with what that pet needs and how it's using those nutrients. So this pet may be very far on the right of that continuum, is we're going to be looking at foods that look for management of obesity. And maybe on the far left, we might be looking for foods that really enhance the ability to exercise and perform. So we know life stage, we know lifestyle. These things influence the nutrition of the pet, but perhaps even more so, we think, well, but aren't there differences in size of pet, especially dogs? They're a tremendously diverse species, from the very small to the very large, and in cats we have changes that we recognize associated with genotype, and the short hair cat, the long hair cat, the size of the cat changes too. So we recognize those things, but we ask, how do we get from where we are in this to where we would like to be with that better understanding of that individual's need? So I want to talk about some of those things. And basically what has happened throughout this whole talk, I'd like to emphasize the change that's happened in science that allowed us to have a different look into the life of pets. And we never would have even imagined when I started, which was a long time ago. But, for a while, these were things we didn't think about. And then we thought, well, only governments can afford this. This is beyond what we will have in our laboratory. To now, these are things that are quite available should we wish to have them. This is a messenger RNA. Maybe familiar, DNA is the kind of blueprint of life. RNA translates that into some sort of actions. Proteins then making that fire, and the metabolites the fire of life that happens from there. But this is a work I did, maybe 15 years ago now, where we were looking at the messenger RNA produced from a census of cats, and we really saw that life stage change. So the DNA is fixed, but life's change was influenced certainly and influenced by the message that DNA was making. Not all DNA is transcribed, and this was saying, depending on the age of the pet, there's a different message. And so the spin, of course, here is that message overlaps. So yes, we could see a change over time, but there were some of those 7 and 10-year-olds that kind of look a little more like they were the young ones, and some of those look a little more like they were the older ones. And you start thinking, well, okay, we can define a life stage and feed to that life stage, but maybe that ultimate goal is to know what that message is and move to the individual being fed associated with that. Kind of a dream, but as we move forward in our research and understanding of pets, I think somewhat achievable. Well, in that continuum, there's really metabolomics. So metabolomics, when I first started, see the age associated with this discussion, but we felt like if we knew insulin and thyroid and growth hormone and maybe glucose and lactose and just a number of maybe very defined outcomes, we would say we know a lot about this pet. But now we have this opportunity to look at the whole metabolome that's present. So hundreds rather than tens of outputs. And it's really a much better understanding of what's happening in the individual. This was a study we ran where we were looking at pets that had a urolithiasis. They had calcium oxalate stone formation, and we saw that there was a significant change in the metabolomics associated with that disease, which again, perhaps isn't surprising, but as it relates to this discussion, we say, oh, but if we know those metabolomics, then that informs us of the decision on what we might want to feed for that individual. And of course, the last one that Dr. Shoveler introduced, and perhaps is the very foundation of this idea of feeding to an individual, is the DNA of that individual. It defines the uniqueness of the pet. This is a Manhattan plot. Basically, it is looking at all of the kind of signposts we'd set up in the complete DNA of cats, and we were saying, well, what does that DNA have to do with this attribute, which was in this case feline specific gravity? And what it had to do with is that there was a group of pets. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but perhaps you can see this little group of pets that are driving above the statistically significant line. That's the pets that had this signpost that was highly related to urine specific gravity. And you start going, okay, first of all, now we know something about the control of this significant component of life for cats. The parenthetical thought is, as you know, cats' kind of ideal place in the wild is a semi-arid environment. They probably need to drink more water, but in the wild, they're going, we don't need to go to places where water is so often. That's a risk factor for the cat in the wild. But we bring them in, we make them our pets. They have plenty of water. We're incentivizing them to drink water in many different ways, have fresh water, have multiple water available, maybe have some gains associated with drinking water, all because we would like them to urinate more and reduce the solute in the urine so that they're at less risk for stone formation. And here we can say, oh, there's some DNA associated with that. And of course, the spin to this conversation is that perhaps that DNA is going to drive us to a different and unique nutritional solution in the lives of those pets. So here's the summary slide. If we see these different things, if we have proteomics, metabolomics, messenger RNA, the DNA, we have different windows into looking into this marvelous thing we call life of pets. And my example is, it's like walking up and looking into the life of a well-running factory. And suddenly you can see things you couldn't see before. Now that we see those things, perhaps we get closer to and drive towards that feeding to the individual that we hope to have. So I'm going to get off presentation, and perhaps here we can get back to our discussion.
Great. Well, thank you for that overview, Dennis. I thought that maybe to get started, I would just prompt you with a few questions that your
Sure.
presentation stimulated in me. So the first one was, when we think about the diversification of ingredients in the pet food industry, do you feel that we are prepared to do a precision approach with plant-based only diets for cats and dogs? And you can parse that out a little bit too, because cats are not small dogs.
Yeah, that's a famous saying around here, is cats are not small dogs, because we keep scratching our head and going, what's happening with the cat? They're unique. So I think foundationally we would agree, and I would state that, it's not ingredients that pets need, it's nutrients. And so if we provide the nutrients required, of course we can use different ingredients. I myself have been involved with foods that were completely animal protein free in dog food, and you have to add some new nutrients. We, for example, found a benefit from adding carnitine, not known to be required in the pet, but certainly was helpful in a food without without animal supply of that nutrient. Taurine would come along in the same way, where you'd think, if I'm going to feed a dog or a cat without animal-based protein, I would certainly look closely at supplementing taurine. So that's the route forward. The easy answer is yes. I can make a food that provides all the nutrients to be, as AFCO would define, we're going to talk about in a minute, complete and balanced. But that optimum nutrition, I kind of think I don't know enough. At least in cat food, I'm gonna be adding some animal flesh to that food. Dog food, yeah, I can make a pretty healthy dog food
Yeah,
without it.
I think for me, my concern about applying plant-based to obligate carnivores like the cat is I'm not sure if we know all the chemical compounds in animal, specifically whole prey, to understand how to mimic some of those with plant. And I'm afraid that we haven't identified some chemical compounds that they might need not to survive, but to thrive.
To thrive, yeah, that's the difference, isn't it? So if we look at, and we're kind of stealing from the next one, but we look at complete and balanced today, it is that ability to survive, maintain body weight, maintain the specific indicators of that long-term health and reproduce. But that's a base. It is not the optimum. And so, I'm sure there are people out there who maybe want to discuss this a little further and disagree with me, but I you'll find that in foods I've designed, you have animal protein. It just, the animal flesh brings with it many things that I like in a nutrient supply for pets.
Yeah, and I think probably very important to point out, and you did say this in your overview, is dogs and cats like animal-based products, so they find them very palatable. And I think we
Yeah,
always have to remember that owners see their pet's desire to eat as a demarcation of quality.
sure.
And if they don't want to eat the food, they become quite concerned.
Yeah.
Question from the audience is what challenges might arise when implementing DNA driven feeding on a larger scale? And can we address these?
Well, the questions arrive in delivery in a moment. You can have so a couple questions, but the one that jumped to mind was you can have a knowledge of what you want to feed that pet, but how then do we provide that pet with that very fine-tuned um, supply? And I actually have had some ideas about that. I remember once I had what I thought was a great idea, and I looked out and saw it was already patented. So other people had had that idea before me. So there are solutions out there. I think if you find in practice, what we will say is, no, we don't have an individual food. It might be truly individual, but it's more likely that suddenly, rather than maybe 100 options, maybe we have 1,000 options of real likely best fit foods, and you'll find one that fits quite well. So I think that's how it runs, right? First, we have to define the needs, and DNA alone is not enough. Boy, I sure want more about that pet than just a knowledge of its DNA, but it adds window into life, and so you start building what that individual would be. Um,
Well, I think too, if I could build on that, because
sure,
there is differences between DNA as the genetic code. And I think maybe what we've done very little research on, and it really speaks to the fact that we have hardly any data on nutrient requirements and nutrient interactions during pregnancy, lactation, and in fact, early nutrition. And in other fields, we're starting to appreciate the impact of nutrition on what we call fetal programming. So, what genes are
sure.
turned on and off. And then that's also affected with early nutrition. And so we now know that what the fetus is exposed to and what the puppy or kitten is exposed to early in life actually is predicting their potentially what diseases they will get later in life. There's an absolute dearth of information in that respect. Would you also talk a little bit, because when we do talk about DNA, one of the things that's very obvious among dogs is, of course, breed differences.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about the science that has supported breed specific nutrition?
Well, yeah, I have an opinion on that. That's interesting. I think we can see a difference associated with difference in dogs, and we observe some of them. Interestingly, a lot of the breed differences. Remember how these breed differences developed? They were selected for, and so, for example, you can see a tremendous amount of breed differences simply defined by the growth hormone IGF-1 axis. So this axis that controls growth and body size. And so suddenly that becomes not so much a breed issue, but it becomes a size issue. And then you start asking, well, how do things scale? Because this little dog on a sort of metabolic body size is probably eating a different sort of calorie intake. If you sort of think originally, well, I want my things to scale according to body weight. And then you start saying, well, oh, I don't know if body weight works so well. When you look at this tremendous diversity within body size, maybe it scales something more like weight to the 3/4 power, which starts screaming, well, that scales pretty nice to energy intake then. So in fact, I've got an energy intake changing. So of course there's a nutrient intake changing, and maybe that supplies the needs of the pets. But then you think, oh no, I think maybe it's not scaling so well to energy intake. Maybe it scales to some other factors. And so now I start wanting to change those associated with those factors, which I think do end up driving more towards not just breed specific, but really for these factors that are driving those changes, things like energy use, things like perhaps the metabolism associated with particular minerals. We know that those very high growing pets that you've interacted with, and certainly has come out of the Netherlands, which I've been so happy with, which has been saying, well, look, these large breed pets, they really need, this speaking of dogs, of course, they really need a finely tuned energy and mineral and sort of intake that is different. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'd say, of course, yes, we want differences. I haven't been a great breed specific answer, but breeds capture some of that. So maybe that's why those foods exist, right?
Yeah, I think ultimately maybe one of the hardest things moving us towards precision nutrition is just the downright diversity in our especially in the canine in the dog among the dog breeds. Maybe a little less so variability in the cats, but that increased diversity is really gonna be a challenge for us to determine what metrics we can use to provide those dogs with more optimum nutrition. So
Yeah.
thanks for that. Why don't we transition and go to the second topic now?
Okay, thank you. I'll see if I can share my screen again, and we'll jump into it. Not quite the clicks I'd hoped for, but here we go. So the second topic is that we want to provide a truly balanced food. And Dr. Scheffler and I have had this conversation a number of times. We both see the need. It's really based on this idea of all things in the nutrient package existing together. I sort of think of it as not too much, not too little, but that requires a definition of optimum. So too little has only meaning when compared to that optimum too much similarly. Well, we have today balanced food defined. So it's balanced because, as we talked a little bit before, it supports life, it supports reproduction. It's balanced associated with, this is just a publication I'm familiar with. I actually was on the committee that set up these, and we said, okay, well, let's have some standards for minimum protein, for minimum amino acids, and Dr. Shuffler would say, well, those are a little dated, Dr. Jewell, and they are, aren't they? But it's what we did at the time, and the minimums then would say, well, if you meet all those minimums, then you have a balance, and that balance will support a complete and balanced claim, and certainly support life and reproduction. We put in some maximums. We were concerned about maximums because we didn't know many things that we thought perhaps should be known. If you drove a stake in the ground and said, here's some maximums, not shown here perhaps, but other maximums exist too. Some of them on ratios, which begin to get that idea of balance for sure. But we were trying to define, a safe issue where not too little, not too much, and here's sort of the definitions. We never expected it really to replace the value of a nutritionist designing a food. You really need to know more than what minimums and maximums are to define a food that would be excellent and perhaps anywhere approaching optimum. But here are some safe limits, and so that became complete and balanced. But it's not really truly balanced. I don't know what the adjective there should be. But this is just a textbook example, and looking at vitamins and antioxidant vitamins, and you suddenly start going, oh, wait a minute, vitamin A and vitamin E interact, and then vitamin C and vitamin E interact, and you could have other nutrients here. If you do the Nernst equations, lipoic acid exists between vitamin C and vitamin E. So if you're doing a high energy electron transfer, you might think that has some value. And suddenly this looks a lot more complex than simply saying, well, have the minimums of these vitamins, because there's interactions and certainly value in understanding those interactions, many of which are unknown. And that's just one of the central themes of this webinar, is that there's stuff here we don't know. Let's go find out. When I was designing foods, I would add more than just meeting the minimums, because I felt optimum was much removed from just meeting the minimum requirements. This is a standard example of minimums for amino acids. And if you had all the amino acids that are essential and enough non-essential that you're not pulling essential off to meet that non-essential amino acid need, it would be in true balance. And that's like this barrel stave. If each stave is like an amino acid in this illustration, and this is one that's in complete balance. If one of those staves start coming down, the barrel doesn't hold as much, and that becomes the limiting amino acid. And what Dr. Shuffler would tell us, and I would agree with, is, we know a lot more about these essential amino acids than we did when we made those minimums, or when the NRC in 2006 established the scientific foundation for minimums. And that's important, because say, for example, we have a nicely robust, 25% protein on a dry matter basis and a normal energy basis in dogs. That may not be sufficient, because some amino acid may be really limiting. And then if that pet gets in stress, they start eating less, or they have a period where they go through some inappetence, and suddenly that intake is not really based on an energy basis, but it's based on how much am I taking today. That balance, even just the meeting the minimums, becomes kind of questionable. And we know that optimum is more than that. We know that the amino acids interact with each other. There's specific amino acid benefit, and true balance would be able to take that into account, which we don't yet know. It's not like I could make food better today because I understand there's this need for true balance in amino acids. I understood it before. We don't have the information, and that's a great thing. That's a positive. We can make really good pet food today. We'll be able to make better if we understand that balance is more than mins and maximums. Just to have an example, again, this is the kind of thing nutritionists play with a lot and think about a lot. You saw perhaps or observed that calcium phosphorus balance was even part of those minimum maximums in the regulatory environment. We know that vitamin D interacts with that. So surely true balance would be some concept of how that mineral interaction was happening with the vitamin interaction, again, with the goal of optimum nutrition for the pet. So I see if I had any more. This is just an example. I've done a lot of work with fatty acids, and they've intrigued me forever, probably because I was at first tremendously surprised that a bean that has the ability to elongate and desaturate and has the ability to metabolize specific fatty acids is so impacted by dietary fatty acids. It just intrigued me. And so we started out, we were looking at the different families of fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. We started looking at different chain lengths of fatty acids and how those medium chain lengths versus the long versus the ultra long chains influence life. And this is just an example of balance in the sense that we had medium chain triglycerides and we had these fish oil N3 very long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, and we put them together 2x2 analysis. And what happens is that each of those fatty acid families influenced specific outcomes, which is sort of shown in this partial least squares analysis, which I think you kind of have to be a statistician to even say those words and not smile. But it allows us to kind of get a central tendency for each of the foods. And you see they're quite different, right? So that there is an interaction, and that's part of balance. So the balance of the optimum benefit would certainly take into account the interaction of the different fatty acids in food. And that's what that study shows. So I wrote this, and it sounded good, but the depth and riches of establishing a truly balanced food is unknown. Yet in looking ahead, it's easy to see that what is to come is greater than what we have today. So I hope that incentivizes us to look for this true balance in nutrients. I think there's much to gain here. And an opportunity perhaps for questions. I'll try and stop sharing here.
Great. Thanks, Dennis, again for the nice lead in. I think maybe I realized right at the end, maybe one question and topic that I think we should discuss is whether a dog or a cat, when we talk about complete and balanced, should a dog and cat or any mammal for that matter be getting the same nutrient delivery every day? Do you think that's healthy?
Well, there's a big discussion about that. I think, again, healthy, yes, absolutely. Optimum, there's some data out there that would suggest it's not optimum. One of the things I was familiar with back when I was more interested in stone formation of cats is that there was actually a protective association with changing nutrients. There was a protective association with prey, that cats that would go out and hunt would be slightly at less risk, suggesting that there's a benefit for interactions. Cats and dogs are not like us, so we would be very uncomfortable, with the same food. I was once on a study where we ate the same food every day for, I believe it was 56 days, or maybe it was 64, 7 or 8 weeks, and I was pretty tired of that food by the end of that period. Our cats and dogs don't seem to have that, so it becomes a question of health. Some cats get pretty. I remember Wishful. I decided canned food was better for Wishful than dry, and Wishful outweighed me. She decided dry food was better than canned, and consumed it. So I think in a benefit, a total benefit, there's some benefit for having that change, and I think some of it's driven by what the pet desires. We certainly have seen tremendous success and long life and very healthy pets while maintaining a specific ingredient and nutrient platform. So I think there's some test. I think I know your answer. I think even by asking it, you'd say, "Oh, I would like to move those around a bit." Am I right?
Well, I think I more so think about, and it's because of the bit of time that I spent in the calorie restriction and longevity kind of space, is that one of the things that's discussed a lot in that space is hormetic responses, which are kind of tiny insults on your intracellular machinery. And of course, if you never challenge that with a different nutrient delivery, um, you don't train your system, your biological system, to be able to thrive in those situations. And of course, we have a lot of metabolic adaptations as mammals and cats, dogs more so than cats. Cats are a little less metabolically flexible than dogs and us. So, they might be a candidate for having a little bit more consistency in their nutrient delivery or their format delivery than maybe dogs and maybe humans. But it's okay to challenge the system. It's no different than experiencing no stress in your life is also, that's not optimum welfare. You need to be able to respond to stresses and cope with
Yeah.
them. And the only way that you can do that, whether that's mental or physiological, is to experience them and be able to react to them. So I think that changing things might help. Do I know how particularly to look at some of those outcomes other than doing longevity studies, which are prohibitive? No.
That's
I
fascinating.
need to give it a little bit more thought.
And so we need to look for markers of that longevity or health, right? So that's an area true where I'm not familiar. I think there are some that are out there. Telomere shortening people talk about and other things, but yeah, we should have that discussion. That I think that'd be interesting.
Yeah, I think we need to get some longevity people on the podcast. Little
Yeah,
note to everybody
yeah.
in the office and online. So with respect to time, why don't we turn it over to the last section, Dennis,
Okay.
and we'll come back and continue our conversation.
Thank you. I think I'm getting better at this. Let's see if I can make it happen quickly. So the last item that I want to talk about today, because it fascinates me, and I hope I can share that with the group, is that there's this desire to feed to the pet and the microbes in it. We knew it was important a long time ago. I like just to show the date because it makes me smile. But my first article in this area was with people I still think highly of in 1978. But what we showed is that when you fed this high lactose food, you had a tremendous amount of energy available for fermentation in the lower gut, which we currently still know much about that. But what we didn't know and really didn't try is what were those postbiotics? We thought about the short chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate, butyrate, and said, okay, this is important. And that's what we could measure. So we measured them. We couldn't grow the microbes in culture. Nothing seemed to work. They would all die. So we didn't measure them. But that has changed. And now we see that we can measure the microbes, we can measure the postbiotics, and it changes where it is in the tract. So you come into the stomach, there's a lot of digestion going on. There's very little metabolism as far as fermentation. In the small intestine, there's a lot of absorption going on. Again, not a lot of metabolism and fermentation, but then it hits the lower gut and the colon, and suddenly there's a lot of fermentation and a lot of microbial action. So we've got this carbohydrate analysis, which or fermentation, which is a saccharolysis, the protein, which is a proteolysis, and the lipids, which is lipolysis. And what's going on, of course, is the the microbes are existing in this nicely provided environment by the host, the pet, and there's crosstalk, there's coordination, and life goes on pretty well together. It actually doesn't go on so well by itself. Interestingly enough, we really gain a lot from the microbes that exist in the colon. So it might be interesting, one would say, to feed them, and to feed them in a way that has optimum value for the pet. So and again, I don't really care so much about the bugs, but I really do care about feeding optimum nutrition to the pet, and thinking about those microbes suddenly gives me a new window into thinking about how I might design foods for the pet. So I wanted to just give you a real life example, just to kind of say, okay, here's where I've been. Basically, what we have shown is that pets consuming different foods have different responses. It changes the microbiota, and most importantly, it changes the interaction the microbes have with the pet. So this is done through some direct interactions, and it's done through some absorption of the postbiotics, and sometimes there's feedback. So if you look at the biosalts, for example, the microbes are interacting with the biosalts, or changing them, they're being absorbed. The pet's going, aha, I know what's down there and what's happening, and so I can move how that interaction flows. So there's interaction and communication between the microbiota and the pet. In this case, we were asking, well, what happens when we feed dogs and cats different levels of protein? And this has been published. One we published in Toxins, one in the Journal of Nutrition. And the idea was specifically, how can we look at the nutrient influence in the microbiota and subsequent influence on the pet? And basically we shifted it. So not surprising, if you feed more protein, you have more protein being metabolized in the lower gut. One of the things that's sort of surprising is that you have to think about the digestibility. So for example, you could have a much different dietary protein intake, but if it was all being absorbed, and of course this isn't, but just by way of example, if 100% of the amino acids were absorbed in the small intestine, it wouldn't matter at all, because they'd just all be gone before the large intestine got the interaction. But that's not actually what happens. It matters in either case. It matters because protein, of course, is escaping digestion, some of it, and being metabolized by the microbiota. And there's some signaling that goes on that the microbiota are responding to. And so there's animal there's host protein that's also being metabolized, and that shifts with diet, with the food being consumed. So what happened is, here in the dog, you see these proteolytic postbiotics were increased. Some of them we don't really like very much. Some of the p-creosyl sulfate, the indoxyl sulfates, these are things that I feel pretty good about. Indole propionate, for example, but I don't feel all that good about indole sulfate. So there's these examples of increased proteolytic postbiotics, and of course that has associated influence on the pet. That's true in the cat as well. I took this from our article just because I sort of liked it as far as a graphical presentation of what's going on. But it's interesting that as the digestion moved through the small and large intestine, in this case, there wasn't that much change in actual protein coming through, and yet we saw this tremendous significant change in things that like matter to the health of the pet, the IgA, things that maybe matter, but I'm not necessarily saying this is good or bad, but just, pH change, branched chain fatty acids. I sort of like the straight, acetate, propionate, butyrate, especially like butyrate, but the branched chain fatty acids, maybe not so much. Increased proteolysis, that's it. Things about gut barrier function change, the mucus layer change. So we had a tremendous effect on the pet by changing the nutrient interaction, or the nutrients supplied in the food to the microbes. And that's That's kind of the story that I have it here today. We want to know, what's the end of these microbiota, and what is this optimum nutrition? It's probably associated with feeding both the pet and the microbiota living within the pet. So that's that talk. Let me jump out of my presentation mode and back to
Great.
back.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dennis. Hey, just a question that I've just often thought about, um, and I don't have an answer for. For the most part, most of our pet owners feed kibble or some form of wet, semi-wet
Yeah.
food. We're seeing a bit of a rise in raw, gently
Mhm.
cooked, and of course, high pressure pasteurization. That
Yeah.
alliteration is always difficult for me.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think about what that is, and you're pounding it, right?
yeah, but warranted for dog food and not for cat food, unless I'm wrong. Is that
Now you
correct?
know more about this than I. Yeah, it's not a
I
place I sprayed.
Yeah, I think more so in dog than cat, but don't take that as gospel. Have you ever thought about, is it kosher that we're feeding aseptic food?
I
I
think with mixed metaphors, I don't even know what that means. But is it best? Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying? Is it good?
is it okay? Because
I said, yes, it's okay. Of course, it's okay. But here's the play, right? So we know that the microbes themselves may have an influence. Some of us are very happy to take probiotics. There's certainly probiotics out there in the marketplace, and a lot of that benefit is seen by components of those microbes. They aren't actually setting up necessarily. Boy, I'm outside of my space here, Dr. Shoveler, but my perspective, maybe I'm always safe there, is that sometimes it's not so important that they're colonizing and living there. They may not even be of the species that will colonize and live that well in that species they're being fed to, but they can still have an effect by providing those sort of, if you will, ingredients associated with cell walls, with the complete package that's being there. And so I think there's, it's an area of active research. People are out there selling products, certainly with some claims. I haven't embraced them all that well. You don't see them in the foods I've designed, but I think there's area there that maybe that's one of those boxes that I can just say, boy, I don't know. I bet there's benefit. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. I even think about the overlay, and you set this up really well at the beginning. We talked about uh the pet industry in general. Um which is highly affected by the human food industry because if we think it's good for us, we think, well, maybe it'll be good for our dog and or a cat. And so there's a lot of different options. So I might steer the listener to we just interviewed Dr. Kelly Swanson from Illinois, and
Yeah,
he talked about fiber. So when we talk about what the microbiome is consuming, and if you want to get your fiber right in your foods, really you can start with that podcast and then kind of spin out from there. But Dennis, maybe, and you just touched on probiotics.
yeah,
I think you call them postbiotics, which we can also feed.
yeah,
And we also have fermented foods, which kind of have postbiotics in
yeah,
them
yeah, absolutely.
because that's what's happening in the hind gut of the animal. And, not to overshare on this or anything, but a big fan of the fermented foods myself, and most definitely am aware of how they kind of support my gut health. Do you want to comment maybe on the prospective possibility of fermented foods and postbiotics in dog food and cat food?
Oh, it's an interesting area, and Dr. Swanson is an expert, so I sure recommend people listening. And it was happened to be a very interesting podcast as well. So wins in a couple places. The so we've got probiotics, prebiotics, and postbiotics in my use of the term, and they all need definition. So we use probiotics as thinking about actually feeding the live bacteria, and I'd really like them to be live, even though I've sort of talked about maybe there's benefit of the non-live components. Prebiotics is I'm feeding particular ingredients for that later gut microbiota. I've been very interested in that. In some ways, I'd love to just change the ecology of the pet to provide right there what it needs. And of course, there are ways of delivering microbe influential ingredients through the small intestine to hit those microbes. You're wrapping them around, getting them wrapped around something like cellulose, or something that pets and we're not very good at digesting, but the microbes chew through pretty well. And then the postbiotics. So, wow, I don't know if I can answer your question. I'm kind of thinking like, this is big. This is important, and yet, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I use one analogy a little bit, which is maybe great for the listeners. And if any of my former undergrads are on, they're probably going to roll their eyes, because all I do is talk about poop. Like I'm obsessed with it or something, and I think they think we're weird.
Yeah, playing with poop. It's a nutritionist concept. It's okay.
Yeah, if I tell people that all the time, if they want to come to grad school, if you can't handle working with poop, dog poop and cat poop won't make you work with human poop, but lots of dog, cat, and dog and cat poop. But I also grew up on a farm, and I still ride horses. And one thing about dogs is they love poop. Whether they didn't like cow shit as much,
Yeah.
but horse poop they love. Cat poop, how many people know their dogs go and litter dive? I call them kitty cigars. And our dog always used to dive in and consume those. So they might be attracted to some postbiotics, some products of fermentation, and I'm not familiar with whether there's literature to suggest that, but anecdotally, I think maybe products of fermentation might be a double win. So a health win and a palatability win. At least that seems what it seems to be like to me when I've observed dogs on farm. So maybe just a couple more questions. One thing I thought might be really important for you to delineate is you mentioned digestibility. And I'm obviously obsessed with digestibility. But I think it might be important for the listener to understand that we can use total tract digestibility for energy in the macronutrients, organic matter, and dry matter. But when we get down to amino acids, as an example, we need to have ileal digestibility measures of these to understand the bioavailability of the amino acids, in particular. Fatty acids, we don't look at digestibility of fatty acids. We look at digestibility of fat more so. So that can be whole total tract as well. But there is, be very careful in looking at amino acid digestibility in total tract. And of course, that's also because amino acids are going to be either utilized or oxidized by the bacteria. They might also be incorporated into bacterial proteins. So you're going to think that they disappear, but they disappear into the bacteria. So just be very cautious when you're planning studies, for example, with digestibilities. Yeah, do you have an addition?
There's not a lot. I think that question is a fascinating one, and of course I don't have much to add, but I would say yes, it's important to think about what's happening through the pet, right? So that when that the food goes out of the small intestine, suddenly what you start measuring is this response associated also with all that microbiota interaction. So things like energy That's energy is neither created or destroyed. It's a great thermodynamic idea. So if it's disappearing, it's going somewhere, maybe not as efficiently if we got glucose out early and butyrate out late, but it's still coming out in a fairly reasonable form. But something like amino acids, it can be both created and destroyed. And so it really, yeah, total track amino acids, no one should care about it. Nitrogen, sort of maintain, so maybe getting in a different form, so we can do nitrogen digestibility, which we then back calculate into protein. Lipids are a little interesting. We should talk about that sometimes. People don't often report lipid digestibility. I have a paper I want to publish where we sort of did a lot of lipid digestibility, and we kind of came up with this integumental lipid loss that I think is pretty important. So yeah, there we go. If you just see digestibility, nutrition is more than digestibility. Please understand that. Maybe that's
just what the animal can harvest from the diet that they eat. That doesn't explain anything that's going on peripherally. Yeah. So with that, and we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Dr. Jewell, for spending this time
My pleasure.
Speaking with myself and presenting to the broader pet food science community. So with that, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. We'd love to hear feedback from you and whether you found this beneficial and what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. With that, thank you very much.
Bye.
Show you what this world can really be. Here with me, I could set you free. Off the pain and misery.